All right, we need to move on and set up our site root folder so we can start to build the HTML for our layout here. Now you'll need to go ahead and get this site root folder set up. In the intro, there is this zip file you can download which has all of this already set up for you, excluding the images we just created, but it does have this simple structure, so make sure you downloaded that. Now let's just quickly take a peek and see what we have set up here. We have an index file like we've worked with in the past. This index file is just as a simple boilerplate. There's nothing in it besides a title for our website, and we're linking to our style sheet, which is called style.css. Notice there's no S. In the previous series through CSS Essentials, we were using an S inside of here, but again, you can call this whatever you want. And then inside of that style sheet that's linked, it's just empty, so we have nothing in our style sheet. And we're going to create all of the code for this HTML page first. So that's how this is set up. And then we also have our images folder, which is inside of our site root, where we'll put all of our website images. And let's go ahead and get started. So let's jump back to the code here, and we'll start to flesh out. I'm going to zoom in just a hair. I'll be zooming in and out a little bit as the code gets longer and longer and harder to read. I'll zoom in and out. But the first thing is to create what we call a wrapper. So I'm going to create a div inside of here. Div ID equals wrap. And then I'll close that div right here. And this div essentially is going to be a div that surrounds the entire website. And this will allow me to center or to move the entire website as one unit. Most sites will employ some sort of wrapper tag, or sometimes they're called container tags. So we have our wrapper tag. And now we're going to jump back to Photoshop, and we're going to start to replicate each of those blocks that we looked at earlier. So we're going to start off with the first section here, which is going to be the header section. So we're going to use the HTML5 tags this time. So let's go ahead and create a header tag. So we have the header tag, and let's go ahead and close the header tag down here. And this header tag, we're going to want to also give an ID of header. And we're doing this just for backwards compatibility, so that we can use CSS to hook into this file instead of calling the header tag selector. So we're going to give it an ID, and that should be good for now. So inside of the header section, we need two other spots. We need a spot for our logo, and then we need a spot for our navigation. So we're going to have two additional sections inside of here. So let's create the first. We'll do these inside of divs. So I'll create a div, and this is going to say ID equals logo. And we'll close that div off. And then we're going to have another div. And this one we're going to use a nav tag, which is an HTML5 tag. We're going to give this an ID of main-nav. Now I'm calling it main nav. On our particular website, we only have one navigation, but some websites have a main navigation up here and maybe a sub navigation down here, or a sub navigation below the main nav. So I'm just calling this one main so we can distinguish if we ever have another one. And let's go ahead and close that nav tag off. So we have our header section. It has a div section and a navigation section inside of it. Now let's continue on down here. Below our header section is where we start into this big giant section, essentially, that wraps our entire website like so. So I kind of have this big area that's going to wrap our featured slider, our left and right sidebars, and this big section right here. So we'll come over here again, and let's go ahead and create another div below here. And I'm going to call this div ID equals, I'll just call this main, which is going to correspond to the main section. And we'll close off this division. And so you can kind of see this start to come to life. We have our entire wrapper, we have our header section, we have our main section. Now inside of the main section we have several sections as well. The first one we come to is the featured slider section. So let's go ahead and create that. So inside of main, we're going to create another div. We'll say div ID equals, and we'll just call this one slider because this is going to correspond to that featured slider. We'll close this div. And the next thing we're going to encounter after that slider div, let's jump back to our mock-up here and look, is going to be our content section. So the next div would be this entire this is essentially the main area of the website, so our entire content. So we'll come over here, and after this slider div, we'll create another one. And this we're going to use with a section tag. And this is another HTML5 tag. So we'll say section, just to kind of illustrate the difference here and use some of the modern tags. So we'll create a section, we'll close the section off, and let's give this section an ID as well. So we'll give this section an ID of, I suppose this is content, so we'll just say content. Following this section div, we're going to have our sidebar div. So the sidebar div is next. Again, we're just using these main sections. We can kind of ignore all the content inside of here. And we're going to use an HTML5 tag for this one as well. It's called aside. And we'll give this one an ID as well. And we'll just call it ID equals side. And we'll close off the aside tag. Whoops, make sure you do the closing tag there. Okay, so we have our aside section, and we open and close the aside. That's pretty much it for our main sections of our code. So just like that, we have most of our wireframe in place. Now it gets a little confusing when you get down here and you have all these closing div tags, close div, close div. You kind of think, well, which one does this correspond to up in this mess up here? And so we're going to add some HTML comments to help us see where things start and end. So you'll notice that this particular div, the main div, starts and ends right there. So I'm going to do an HTML comment right to the side of this. And I'm just going to say end and then main and then 2 dashes. So that's an HTML comment. And I'm going to copy this and paste it right down here. This div is the ending div for this one way up here, which is the wrapper div. So this one ends the one that's called wrap. So that'll just help us see both of those. And we could also do one here on the aside. We could say end, this one ends this side, etc., etc. These are the main ones that I'll add those ending tags on. This one's pretty obvious. This one's pretty obvious. But they may get a little bit more messy when we start adding code. That'll just help us quickly see which divs correspond to which divs. So that's the wireframe. And in the next video, we're going to start to add the CSS.